Millennials, what's something you were taught growing up that turned out to be completely wrong in adulthood? I was told by the school nurse in high school in an abstinence-only state in the early 2000s that rubbers were absolutely no defense whatsoever against AIDS. She drove this point home repeatedly, describing how small it was and explaining how dangerous AIDS was, and how rubbers had these holes in the fabric small enough for AIDS to pass through. I went on believing that until I was in my late 20s when I happened upon the actual fact, which was, yes, what I was taught is technically true for sheepskin. You know, the kind they stopped using generations ago, and certainly not the kind they typically sell over the counter. Yes, I am sure they still make such things, and yes, I know they still have like a printed 3 out of 1,000 failure rate or some such. But the school made it clear, falsely as far as I now know, that all, latex or otherwise, had a 100% failure to protect from HIV and AIDS. Yep, and that's why abstinence-only education is crap. Story 2. My mom dragged me to a lot of adult-only work-related events when I was a kid, 4 to 12 years old, as she had this need to show off her family. She was basically one of those mothers that everyone likes to complain about, the ones who just won't leave little Susie at home because she's so well-behaved, and would love attending a 6-hour-long evening of grown-up stuff and ends way past her bedtime. Every time there was dinner, awards ceremony, silent auction, bridal shower, etc., I was expected to go. And every time I asked, would there be other kids there? And every time my mother would answer, yes, there will be loads of other children there. And every time we arrived, the youngest person there was 30, but I was at that age where you trusted what your parents told you. So even though deep down I knew my mom was lying to me, there was always a spark of hope that she wasn't, which was dashed every single time. Story 3. Back when we were kids in the 70s and 80s, my dad's company gave every family a turkey based on family size for Thanksgiving, and a ham or alternate roast for Christmas and the holidays. Every summer they rented out the local amusement park, roller coasters and all, and made all the dogs and burgers and drinks free, just for the kids and families to have a good day. Paid the workers too. He got an extra week of vacation for his 5th, 10th, 15th, and 20th year. The 25th, they gave him a gold watch. The 30th, they flew him to Europe with my mother, all expenses paid. The 35th, they bought him a gorgeous grandfather clock. He had a pension, a 401k, and maxed Social Security. And so the last few years, he paid no match toward his health care either. Along the way, without having to apply and re-interview, they promoted him 6 or 7 times and made sure his real pay always went up, as they trained him to do more and manage more. They hired him at 19 without so much of a day of college and took care of him until he retired. He applied there in the first place because he could walk there from his house in a pinch. He still can, only now his house is renovated and bigger. Almost unbelievable, that type of thing nowadays. Story 4. My brother convinced me that tornadoes are gigantic mutant tomatoes that escape from mad science labs and wreak havoc on towns. I always imagined it as a really big and mean Bob from VeggieTales. I totally believed it, seeing the pictures of the aftermath. I just thought nobody could live to take a picture of one. So one day in kindergarten, tornadoes are somehow brought up. My seat neighbor asks how they're made, and my other neighbor told him it was strong winds. I laughed in that schmuck's face, and then proceeded to fight tooth and nail, even against the teacher, convinced that they were tricking me into thinking it was all just wind. I couldn't grasp that strong air could rip up a whole town. My brother finally had to be the one to tell me he was just kidding when the teacher sent me home with a note. Can you imagine the chaos, not from tornadoes, but giant tomatoes raining from the skies, splattering unsuspecting townsfolk? Story 5. My first job out of college around 2002 was for a local hospital in their IT department. They were opening 6 new family care practices to help consolidate their local healthcare monopoly. Just under 2 years later, I had finished the final computer installations at the final practice and arrived back at the hospital in the company vehicle they trusted me to drive, sat at my desk, and tried to log into my computer. My password didn't work. Moments later, my boss called and asked me to come to HR where I was fired for something I had supposedly done a month prior. Then they fought my unemployment claim. They stuffed a written warning in my personnel file, and on the signature line, my former boss wrote, given verbally on such and such date. They won. I appealed and they brought a lawyer to the hearing and won. It was undoubtedly well worth the money for the unemployment insurance to save them on their 1,000 other employees. Any concept of loyalty I might have had to an employer passed away with that job. Employment is business. Always act in your own best interests and no one else's because an employer will never do right by you. Story 6. In grade school, if your assignments are not written in cursive in middle school, they will fail you. In middle school, I'll fail you if you write in cursive. I'm here to teach you Jane Schaefer-style writing, which you must use in high school, or they will fail you, not to decipher your useless hieroglyphics. In high school, pretty much as long as your paper contains a start, middle, and an end without changing topic, it's good, bro. BTW, don't complain about how hard our classes are. College is like 10 times harder than this. In college, right, so we're aware that many of you come from high schools whose idea of a straight A student was that you optimally never did the same things twice, so we are going to start you from the beginning and go really slow about it, plus a bunch of side meetings to help you get up to speed. Because the more intense stuff, like doing calculations by hand, we teach you is going to be required by whatever job you have. At my job, for Christ's sake, do not do calculations by hand. You might be wrong. This is why we have computers. If you get the calculation wrong, people will be harmed and we get sued. If the computer gets it wrong, people still get harmed and we still get sued, but we can pass that lawsuit on to the maker of our calculator programs. You don't even need those skills for anything anyway. In master's degree program, why can't you do this by hand? Industry requires you to do it that way, so you should be experienced at it. Anyway, now we are going to program a game engine from scratch because that's how real companies do it. I started my own game company. Screw that crap, we're using Unity. Story 7. Used to go camping. My dad would use that as an opportunity to scare us into paralysis every time. So he made up all of these wild, terrifying monsters that lived in the woods nearby. Nothing so crazy that it was obvious, like evil mermaids in the lake or anything. He would base his imaginings on real, obscure wildlife, so if we asked a teacher about it, they would usually confirm that whatever creature really exists, yes, it's dangerous, and never listen to our little kid stories long enough to figure out that we genuinely believe there were basically feral, Pokemon-esque animals populating the region. Unrelated to the fantasy monsters, I was told growing up that I was diagnosed diabetic, and that I had to take a certain medication to control my hyperglycemia or I could end up in a coma any day. Yeah, I'm not diabetic, my sugar is fine, if a bit low sometimes. And the medication I was on for 3 years was an antidepressant my mom had gotten prescribed for herself from a sketchy doctor friend of hers. I was a weird kid before my diabetes, but I was sincerely troubled by the time medical professionals caught on to that. Story 8. One thing I've noticed about a lot of these comments is that at the time we were taught things, they weren't exactly wrong. At the time, calculators were not pocket-sized. People did benefit from job loyalty until we watched our parents be kicked to the curb with the recession. There was no easy access to information to fact-check things such as the food pyramid, or even the decency of authority figures for that matter. You had very specific access to the information that was heavily controlled by the government and news outlets unless you had hours to spend at the library, and even then, libraries may not have books on the info you needed. Quote-unquote, back in my day, ha ha ha. Story 9. When I was a kid, my dream was to operate excavators, tractors, big trucks, and whatnot. Those just look so dang cool. My neighbor's father had his own excavation company, and I just wanted to be like him. One day in class, we read a book that by the year 2000, cars would be flying and sidewalks would be bringing us to where we want to walk to. Reading this broke the dream for me. Can you imagine an excavator or a front-wheel loader that flies? It looks disgusting and stupid. I don't want to drive that. When the year 2000 came, I was angry. The book had lied, and cars weren't flying, and excavators and tractors still looked cool as heck. By then, my career was headed somewhere else, and I had missed out on driving those amazing machines. Screw you, book, that made me believe excavators would fly. Story 10. One time when I was a kid, maybe 4 or 5, I got a balloon at a carnival. On the way to the car, the balloon got free and started to float away. My grandparents, who took me, went on to explain that the balloon is going to fly all the way across the Atlantic and land somewhere over in Germany. This was their way of calming me down. What actually happened was my grandmother got a hold of a friend of hers who lived over in Germany and got them to write me a letter saying that they found my red balloon and sent the letter and balloon to me in the mail. I was so happy that someone found it. Went to visit them 10 years later as a teenager and said, "Remember the time when you found my red balloon and sent it to me?" Their reply, "Your grandmother told us to do it." What an epic letdown. Story 11. When I was 6, my mom, grandpa, and I were walking through a forest and I wanted to go down to the river. My grandpa told me we couldn't because we didn't have a gun to fight the crocodiles that live there. Every time we went on this trail, I would mention to my mom offhandedly, "This part is where the crocodiles live, right?" When we got to the path that led to the river, and my mom each and every time told me, "Yep, we can't wake them up," I was about 10 when I finally realized that there was no way a colony of crocodiles lived in rural Canada, and not even my friends bothered to correct me. For 5 years, I believed that the nearby river was crocodile infested. Story 12. I used to have an uncle who had had heart surgery, so once when I was little and we were at the beach, I noticed the scars he had from surgery. When I asked my dad what those scars were from, he told me a story. He said Uncle had bravely fought off a lion in Africa and survived with only the scar remaining. As a little kid, I obviously had no reason to doubt the story that my uncle had fought off a lion with his bare knuckles. So I proceeded to tell everyone around me the story of my uncle who survived this incredible fight. Now fast forward to when I'm roughly 19. Some of the family members are all sitting together to share dinner, then they start talking about said uncle, that he has to be operated on his heart again. I didn't understand the meaning of being operated again, so I started processing it and started asking questions, asking everyone about the lion fight. So at the sweet age of 19 years old, I realized that my childhood was a mere lie. The man I had idled for fighting off a lion, it was all a lie. Nonetheless, his second operation went fine. Right, to be honest, undergoing heart surgery twice? I feel like it's a much bigger feat and proof of strength than fighting off a lion. Story 13. It boiled down to, as long as you do as you're told and follow the rules, don't make a fuss and don't get ideas above your station, people will see how hard you work and you'll be appropriately rewarded. This is absolutely not the case. If you don't ask for anything, you don't get anything, and only doing as you're told and following all the rules to the letter not only fails to push and progress you, it's also no guarantee you'll be safe and secure. You can follow every rule and still be falsely accused or wrongfully convicted or hit by an intoxicated driver. You can still be the name that gets picked out of the hat for layoffs. You can still get caught up on circumstances beyond your control. Being good and quiet and obedient leaves you extremely vulnerable. Story 14. A vast number of things I learned about social history. The one that made me feel especially lied to was the pop culture idea that corsets were unilateral, harmful devices and impossible to function in. That's in so many movies, and while tight lacing was a thing that existed among the ultra fashionable, and sometimes for special occasions, women didn't do it most of the time for the entire 500-year history of corset and corset-like garments. It's erasing the reality of women's lived experiences throughout history, and it makes me furious now whenever I see it in movies. Sure, it doesn't impact the grand scheme of things, but it's still giving us an incorrect understanding of the past, at the expense of people who come from a systematically oppressed group, no less. With other social history myths, teachers and sometimes even museums will repeat the most insane things because their own history education only relied on getting things like important men's names and the dates of battles correct. When it comes to daily life, people have been believing anything that sounds even halfway plausible at first glance for like decades. Story 15. Dating and finding a life partner. The way dating works and how it was explained to me in the 90s and 2000s turned out to be a complete lie, and that has hurt me deeply in many different ways. Being honest, hardworking, physically active, well-dressed, humble, polite, and an educated person seeking the company of others isn't what automatically results in finding someone at some point. And while I haven't given up hope, I've started to become a little bit bitter about it, to be honest. I largely feel that the introduction of the internet, dating services, apps, and social media is largely to blame for the fact that adults around me couldn't see how it would change the dating culture and customs. Especially in small countries like Finland, where women and men could start dating the top 0.1% of potential dream partners outside their own communities, people which they never before had any access to throughout the whole country and the world. It has had a degrading effect on women and men alike. The economy has been steadily utter crap for most of us probably, and unlike my parents who could afford a house at age 20, I probably cannot ever afford one, which hurts my chances of finding a partner as well, I think. Not to mention how expensive everything has become in general. Also, maybe a little controversial, now that in Western countries, women and men are freer to choose what to do. This has resulted in more women choosing to focus on their careers instead of becoming partners, getting married, and starting a family, or choosing to not be with men at all. And I'm not saying that it's wrong, but my grandmother used to always tell me that for everyone there is someone. And lately, I started to think that she's wrong because that someone probably has chosen to not be with me, even though we've never even met. Just my 5 cents on the topic. Story 16. Not me, but my college roommate. Mind you, she was an engineering student at a fairly decent university. As a child, she had asked her older brother what happens to cans when they're recycled. He told her they were used to make airplanes. She became an avid can returner after that, bringing her recycles back to the grocery store to the can deposit system. I think she may have gotten a sense of excitement out of thinking she was contributing to aircraft development. She believed this all the way up until college, when apparently during a physics seminar she made a serious inquiry about how such thin aluminum can survive at high altitudes. When she commented on how airplanes are made from recycled cans, the class and professor all reacted hysterically. I came home to find her under her bed covers eating chocolate, all distraught. "Did you know airplanes aren't made of cans?" were the first words out of her mouth. Story 17. My mother had 3 kids under the age of 5, so in a brilliant effort on her part to get some peace and quiet, she either came up with or borrowed the idea and told us if you put salt on a bird's tail, it couldn't fly away and you could keep it for a pet. My siblings and I spent countless hours running around the backyard with salt shakers attempting this feat. Flash forward about 10 years, I told one of my friends we could catch a bird this way, and she looked at me like I was insane. Dragged her to my mom to get her straightened out. My mom looked blank for a minute, then laughed and said, "Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. I didn't think you still believed it." The humiliation was complete, and yeah, I was angry there for a while. Story 18. When I was 6, I moved to the next city along with my parents. Brand new start, I didn't know anyone. One day, my mom told me, "You're Princess Lollipop, and I'm the queen, and Dad is a king." A few weeks later, I started my new school, and whilst introducing the new kid to the class, my teacher asked me to tell the class something about myself. So I, so sure of myself, told them that I am a princess, and my parents are the king and the queen. I told each of my new friends this story until one person laughed and didn't believe me. It upset me, and I told my mom when I got home that this kid at school didn't believe I was a princess. She looked at me all confused, like, "What do you mean you're a princess?" I said, "You said that I'm Princess Lollipop. You're the queen and Dad's the king." She burst out laughing, remembering what she'd told me weeks prior, and said something along the lines of, "Oh, honey, I was only joking. We're not really the king and queen, but you're still my princess." I can still remember the mix of anger and embarrassment I felt, knowing I'd honestly believed her and had gone around telling all my new friends at school. Luckily, we were only 6, so the next week nobody remembered. Story 19. It seems silly, but I was told black holes aren't real. But I grew up in a super religious family and I started experiencing dissonance young. My mother is a biblical literalist, meaning creating the earth took exactly 6 days, the earth is exactly 6,000 years old, etc. And therefore science is just a crock of lies. She had a 400-page book written by Ken Ham exposing all the lies of science. Turns out carbon dating can't be trusted because we carbon dated this non-organic mass, and carbon dating was wrong. Evolution is a lie because if it came from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? That sort of thing. It rocked my world when I discovered that the sci-fi books I'd been reading were not entirely nonsense. Black holes are real, extrasolar planets are quite common, and there's a good chance you used Einstein's relativity today. And if science can get relativistic physics and gene therapy right, why wouldn't they be able to get evolution or carbon dating right? So anyway, when your Bible-thumping mother tells you that black holes are made up, just like the fossil record, feel free to keep rebelling. Story 20. That going to university is the only way to success. It wasn't for me. I knew it wasn't for me, but I still gave in to the pressure. Ended up getting more anxious and depressed, began skipping classes and dropping out halfway through. Now I've got all the debt with nothing to show for it. Ended up doing a TAFE, essentially a community college course, and getting a decent job where both my bosses, best bosses I've ever had, I'd never gone to university. One worked in retail and the other one in their blue-collar family business. Story 21. We were learning about shapes in elementary school. The topic of our favorite 3-sided fellow, the triangle, came up, and with it a discussion of its angles. Specifically that its angles added up to 180 degrees. Some particularly curious child in the class asked the teacher why triangles specifically have 180 degrees. This obviously caught her off guard and she hesitated before saying, that's a good question, I don't know. Now this would have been a perfectly acceptable answer to a 9 or 10-year-old me because dumb math logic is dumb, right? But the teacher, refusing to acknowledge her lack of teaching, doubled back on her statement and said, "Well, think of it this way." Oh boy. A straight line is 180 degrees, right? So if you unfold a triangle, it becomes a straight line, which is why a triangle has 180 degrees. We all seem to accept that as revealed by our collective outburst of, "Oh." But after I thought about it for a second, I realized that if you unfold any shape, it can make a straight line. Instead of being an insufferable smart though, I just sat there silently thinking to myself, what the heck are you talking about? And if you're enjoying what we're talking about so far in this video, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 22. I'm late to the party, but someone will see this and get a laugh, hopefully. When I was about 6, I turned the thermostat up to 90 because I was cold. My mom came into the living room and felt the heat raging, looked at the thermostat and realized what I had done. She then told me not to do that again because if the thermostat is set too high, the house will blow up. Fast forward 10 years later, I'm in high school and my parents are out of town, so I had a few friends over. They asked if I could turn the heat up a little because it was freezing in my house, to which I responded, "Oh, nah, man, my house is really old and the thermostat is all janky, so if I mess with it, the house might blow up." I had made up a story as to why the house would explode in my head over the years. My friends asked me why I thought that. I said, well, when I was 6, my mom told me that if I Oh, crap. For 10 years, I thought my house would explode if I touched the thermostat. Story 23. So, I have 2 older sisters, and we're all within 3.5 years of each other in age. My oldest sister swears to this day that she never told us this, but the middle sister and myself both remember the exact same story coming from her. Our dad was adopted. We knew this, but we didn't know anything else at the time. His adoptive parents passed away before we were born, and he had no siblings to our knowledge. But we didn't know anything about the details of his birth parents and whatnot. When we were like 4, 6, and 7 respectively, my eldest sister said my dad was abandoned and found by his parents on the bumper of a truck. Not sure logistically how big of a bumper would be needed and if that's even possible, but yeah, we believed her for a long time. Can't remember when I found out, but I guess my suspicion grew over the years. Story 24. As an old millennial, I think, without a doubt, it was work hard and you will be rewarded for it. I feel like we might have been the first victims of this now widely known fallacy. I'm talking about generation, not gender, race, religion. Many of us grew up and saw that to be true, and by the time we got to the age we could reap the fruits of our labor, it wasn't true. Miltonian economics and fully taken route, we legit thought we were entering a progressive, accepting world, and upon graduation got kicked in the mouth. I think the younger millennials and Generation Alpha knew early in their lives this is all of us screwed, while us old millennials were and some still are true believers. Side note, I think the hopelessness of feeling like we are all screwed is what's driving the younger generations to the right. On the surface, the right messaging is so much more palatable and requires less effort than the left. The right says, don't worry about it, vote for us and we'll take care of everything. And the left says, vote, think, pay attention, take action if you want change. Story 25. When I was a kid, we had cats, and they all started having kittens. I think the final count was somewhere in the neighborhood of 26 cats, mostly newborn kittens, not crazy cat lady house. My dad and stepmom told us they were taking the cats to a cat farm. We accepted that as truth and envisioned our cats living out their lives on a quaint farm with a barn, making friends with cows. Fast forward 20 years, and I work in a real estate office. I'd never mentioned the cat farm to anyone before, but we had a client who was buying a house and he had to get rid of his cats. I immediately offered up the information about the cat farm and offered to call my stepmom to get him contact info. I called her right in front of him. Hey mom, remember when I was a kid and you took our cats to a cat farm? Yeah, I have a client who would like to take his cats there too. Long pause and then a giant burst of laughter rang into my ear. She confessed they took all the cats to the woods near our house and let them go. I was devastated and had to think of what I was going to tell the client. I said goodbye, hung up the phone, and politely told him the cat farm was closed. My face and ears were on fire. Story 26. I come from Denmark. When I was like 6 or 7, my legs started to kind of hurt in the evening at bedtime. I told my mom and she explained a Danish word to me, which is best translated to growth, like your legs are growing. Sort of why your teeth hurt as a child, well, because of growth. Anyway, I was blown away by that fact. Some days later, one evening in bed, the growth is only in my right leg. I tell my mom and my dad about it, and immediately my dad gets this nervous look on his face and says, that's not good. That's not good at all. And my mom chimes in, yeah, that's bad. And I go, why? My dad goes, did I ever tell you about my uncle? I went, no. He continues, who passed away from starvation? I go, no. He follows up, his right leg was so long he could only walk in circles, so he never ate, he never made it to the kitchen. That night, the growth came back only in the right leg. I remember punching that leg 40, 50 times at least until the feeling of growth would go away. And I never told my parents again when I had growth. After all, I had a feeling they would know once I became the human version of a flamingo. Story 27. My dad once told me that if you pinch your nose and blow, your eyes will pop out. He told a long, involved story about how Germans used this as a method in World War I. Fast forward 4 or 5 years to when I'm 10 or 11. My family's on a plane coming back from vacation. I'm sitting next to my mom. I start experiencing really terrible pressure in my ears, which I've never felt before. I'm whining to my mom when a monk sitting in front of me turns around and tells me to hold my nose and blow. Obviously, this has me shook since I know for a fact this will cause my eyes to pop out. I say to my mom, but Dad says my eyes will pop out. I don't remember her exact response, but it was something along the lines of a snort. Figuring out my dad was a big-time liar, popped my ears, and my eyes stayed intact. I told my dad the story a couple of years ago, and we both got a big laugh out of it. Story 28. Little girls that don't hold their moms' hands in the parking lot or store would get stolen by trolls and turned into hamburgers. I didn't like trolls or hamburgers, but I did like sprinting in parking lots and hiding in clothes racks with my feet up. My mom told me that the box of tampons I found were rockets, so I took the first opportunity I could to shoot the entire box out of my grandparents' living room window. My mom found them all over the driveway when she got home from work, mortified. The recording of the man that used to start playing after the phone was left off the receiver for far too long was called The Ugly. If I didn't stop playing with the goddamn house phone, he would come through the handset as a cloud of butterflies and carry me away forever. One of my mom's favorites was called The Man. According to her, this threat worked for a stretch, but I caught on while purposefully dropping french fries on the diner floor like a schmuck. My frustrated mother warned me to cut it out. If you don't stop and eat your food, I'm going to call The Man. I immediately fired back, that's okay, go ahead, do it. You know what? I'll do it. Hands on my hips, I called for The Man in an exaggerated sing-song before turning to say, well, I guess he's not coming. She was speechless. I was smug, and that was the last I heard of The Man. There's just so many. I don't know how parents put up with me, especially my mom. Story 29. My dad had a deviated septum surgery, and my uncle was in town to help for a couple of days of recovery. We went to a Lion's restaurant to get some soup for my dad. Before we walked in, my uncle said, this is great. It's Tuesday. They do chicken noodles on Tuesday. And my kid Brian, I combined this with the other soup data point where most places have clam chowder on Friday. I put together the concept of a national soup schedule and never questioned it. Mind you, we do not eat a lot of soup, so I didn't have much opportunity to test this concept, and it held up for the most part when I paid attention. Fast forward 20 years when I'm going to a brand new restaurant in a brand new city with my now wife, and she says, soup sounds good. I say something to the effect of, it's Tuesday, they'll have chicken noodle. I get a look of utter confusion, followed by wheels turning, followed by laughter. She put together that I thought there was a soup schedule that all restaurants had followed, and proceeded to explain the harsh realities of the restaurant world to me. Not only did I think this, I had thought this for 20 years. Story 30. That you can be anything when you grow up. It kind of glossed over the whole aptitude and enjoyment thing. I let a couple of companies try to push me down a management track before realizing that I just can't feel productive doing management things. Even though I know it's important, it doesn't feel like real work to me, and it largely ignores where the majority of my experience is. Also, the food pyramid. Turns out they didn't know crap about food, and pretty much everything they ever told me about substances. Turns out they didn't know crap about either. Seems like the negative effects of prohibition are way worse than the substances. Apparently, a lot of legal ones were way worse than illegal ones too. Story 31. Not quite something I was told, but one time my father yelled from the bathroom to get the cordless phone and a rag for him. I got both, pushed it through the opening in the door he made, and pretended to walk away. This was a very odd request for him, so I had to know who he was calling. Hey, my jewels are wounded and they won't stop. What should I do? He asked. I quickly walked into my room, regretting listening. A few days later, they had the talk at my elementary school years early. I figured it out. My father was on his period. I went along with his belief a long time. I eventually realized that males didn't have those, but figured it was some other hole. I'd lost my V card before realizing there is, in fact, no holes. Story 32. I've mentioned this before, but somehow or another, my father somehow convinced me that the brown UPS delivery trucks were called broccoli trucks. No, they didn't deliver broccoli, they delivered packages. No, they were not associated with broccoli in any way at all. So why were they called broccoli trucks? Damned if I know. Dad logic. I learned the truth about things far later than I should have, in middle school actually, when I offhandedly remarked that I'd seen a broccoli truck in the parking lot. My teacher overheard me and asked me to point it out, then gave me a look of skeptical confusion when I indicated the UPS truck. That was a moment when I realized my dad might have made up the whole broccoli truck bit. I wound up trying to explain that it was a family tradition to refer to delivery vehicles by odd names, but everything I said only seemed to make my teacher grow more suspicious. Upon hearing the story from me, my father did a very poor job of restraining his laughter. Story 33. Gravity. Yep, it's not a force, it's not pulling you to the ground is accelerating upwards. You're merely held against the earth because its mass is warping the envelope of space and time, pulling it towards itself. If you jump out of a plane, no force, ignoring air resistance, is imparted onto you. You are merely floating neutral to the coordinates of space and time. What is happening is the ground is accelerating towards you. How is it accelerating upwards and the world is not tearing apart? Gravity is literally warping the coordinates of space around you. It's why light with no mass is still affected by gravity. We teach it completely wrong. Story 34. My dad used to be the biggest farter. I mean, after he'd have a few beers, stouts usually, he would fart the worst smelling farts you could possibly imagine. They were so bad I used to cry when he did it. He told me if he didn't fart, he would blow up like a big balloon and float away. I 100% believed this until I was like 13. I somehow associated it with the Harry Potter movie where his aunt floats away. I didn't associate as a kid that it was magic in the movie. Honestly, when I found out, I was kind of relieved. I remember as a kid trying to fart as much as I could in literal fear of blowing up and floating away. Story 35. I was taught, without irony, mind you, that every single human being on this planet was doing their best to be a good, wonderful person, and that it was only circumstance, or maybe the government, or I guess also maybe chance, that stopped that beautiful flower from becoming the greatest, lovingest, most beautiful soul that ever lived, who also loved everyone and would pass away for you. This was what everyone fundamentally was, and never doubt that they want to be good and that they are trying their best. So always be kind and patient and loving. That's what I was taught. Turns out that, I don't know, at least 20%, possibly 80% of all the humans alive today are capricious, dishonest, fundamentally evil creatures who value nothing, believe in nothing, and would nuke the entire planet if they felt that proved they had quote-unquote won. Monkeys with nuclear weapons, firearms, and lawyers. Not a fun thing to wrap your mind around as a small child, that the ridiculous hippie overlords who attempted to impose their simplistic, childish, and aspirational worldview on you were just, in fact, animals who hated life, never cared about reality, and never gave a single thought to how horrible it would be to be raised so naively and have to learn the truth the hard way. Not that I'm bitter, of course. Story 36. This story happened to my wife, not me, for years. Every time they drove by it, my father-in-law would mention to my wife and her brother that this place, named Wishes, had a great lunch buffet. They took it as a gospel truth without a second thought. Not long after we started dating, we drove by and she told me the same thing. I whipped my head around and asked her what she meant and how she knew that because I grew up in the same area. Curiosity and an internet connection had told me it is a club. I relayed this information to her and she eyed me suspiciously, not believing her father would lead her on like that. I busted out laughing, realizing the long con he had played on them while she sat in the front seat and fumed at me. When we got to her house, she ran to her dad expecting him to tell me off. Instead, he and I were both almost on the floor in laughter, which made her even more upset. I continue his tradition to take advantage of her gullibility constantly. She truly married her father. Story 37. Literally everything my parents ever told me, but here are some highlights. No, you're not getting fat. I was. And if you eat less, your body will conserve calories and you will get fat. So I continued eating as normal and guess what? Got fat. Thanks, Mom. If you don't go to college immediately after high school, you'll ruin your education and flunk out. So I threw away basically my entire life to go to college immediately with no plan of what to do there. Now I work in a warehouse. Turns out taking a year off statistically improves your college performance, but oh well, thanks again, Mom. People will always hurt you and attack you. There's nothing you can do about it. It's your responsibility to stay out of everyone's way. Life is going to be unfair and painful, and if that upsets you, then there's something wrong with you. Turns out life, in my society at least, is actually mostly sensible and predictable, and people are mostly good. It was unnecessary for me to spend all my school days hiding in stairwells and my adulthood avoiding eye contact. Thanks so much, Mom. My parents also lied to me a lot for fun because kids are just amusingly gullible, I guess. So there's a long list all on its own, but that seems to be common. Also, no one in the world knows how to properly brush teeth. Not you, not your parents, not your dentist even. Just gargle some sand. You're boned anyway. 3 minutes, 5 minutes, circles, straight lines, hard, soft. Toothpaste, no toothpaste, screw it. Chew some steel wool. Story 38. When I was around 4 or 5, my dad told me that Rocky passed away at the end of the first Rocky movie and that his son, also named Rocky, took up the mantle of being a boxer. He told me that you actually call Rocky II, Rocky II, and that at the end of that movie, the same thing happened, and so on and so forth. All I knew about the Rocky series was that Rocky IV had a robot in it, so I assumed it took place in the future and didn't question him. I never actually watched the movie, so I believed that one up until last year. Someone in my playwriting class made some kind of reference to Rocky, and I made a joke about the main character of his play dying at the end. Naturally, everyone was super confused and had to explain to me that no, Rocky does not pass away in a boxing match only to be succeeded by a son, also named Rocky, who also passes away in a boxing match who was then succeeded by his son Rocky III, who then also passes away in a boxing match later to be avenged by his son, in turn, Rocky IV. Looking back, I was kind of a dumb kid, but I guess it shows how much trust kids put in their parents. Story 39. I was very traumatized by the fact that Santa was not real. I just had a great Christmas with my family. I was 10 in 4th grade, and I spent a lot of time on Christmas Eve trying to stay away on the stairs to catch him in the act. I eventually gave up and went to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I ran downstairs and I saw all the glistening lights on the trees and the presents underneath it. I turned my head to my stocking and went over to shake it. Something big and heavy fell out. It was a large Christmas sleigh bell with a wide leather strap attached to it. My eyes widened as I realized it was a sleigh bell. I cradled it in my hands and took it to my sister as I tried to explain my luck. When I found out later that day that Santa wasn't real, not only did my sister laugh at me for believing for so long, and my parents look at me with their eyebrows closing in on the arches of their eyes with pity, but I also lost some powerful, meaningful moments in my childhood. That moment when you wake up on Christmas Day and realize the ramifications of the date. That first glimpse of the tree when your eyes need to adjust to consciousness and it's almost too pretty to take in at once. It was a tragic and sorrowful day. But if you like these stories, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video, and thanks for watching.